Mark Thompson was the kind of guy who liked things simple. His life revolved around his morning coffee, weekends spent tinkering in his garage, and the quiet comfort of living in a neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened. That is, until one fateful Saturday morning when everything changed. It started with the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Mark was watering his front yard when he glanced up and saw an unfamiliar white van parked outside his house. The logo on its side read Secure View Solutions, but something about it felt off. Before he could think much of it, the driver's door swung open, and out stepped Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed queen bee of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She wore her signature oversized sunglasses and carried a clipboard like it was a royal scepter. Behind her trailed two burly men dressed in work uniforms, each carrying heavy toolboxes. They didn't look like your average camera installers. They looked more like people you'd call if you needed someone to build a fence or move a piano. Still, Mark figured this had to be some HOA initiative Karen cooked up without consulting anyone first. He sighed inwardly, knowing how these things usually went. "Good morning, Mark," Karen chirped, striding toward him with the confidence of someone who always got their way. "We're here to make your home safer." "Safer?" Mark repeated, lowering his watering can. "What do you mean?" Karen gestured vaguely toward the roof. "Security cameras. For the neighborhood. It's all part of our new safety initiative." Mark blinked, taken aback. "You're putting cameras on my roof? Did I agree to this?" "Oh, don't worry about the details," Karen said breezily, already turning away. "It's covered under HOA policy. Trust me, you'll thank us later." Before Mark could protest further, the two workers brushed past him and began climbing a ladder propped against the side of his house. He watched in disbelief as they hauled their tools onto his roof, completely ignoring his objections. "Wait a minute," Mark called after them. "I didn't sign anything for this." Karen turned back briefly, adjusting her sunglasses. "Relax, Mark. This isn't personal. It's for everyone's benefit. Think of it as a community service." Community service? Mark thought bitterly. More like dictatorship. He knew better than to argue with Karen once she set her mind to something. Over the years, she'd turned the HOA into her own little kingdom, enforcing rules no one asked for and fining neighbors over minor infractions. But installing cameras on his roof, that crossed a line. He stood there helplessly as the workers drilled holes into his shingles and mounted sleek black devices along the edges of his roofline. Each hammer strike echoed through the otherwise peaceful morning air. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, curious but too intimidated by Karen to intervene. Even Mrs. Peterson from across the street gave him a sympathetic wave before retreating behind her curtains. By the time the crew finished, Mark's roof looked like a tech showroom. Karen inspected their work with obvious satisfaction, jotting notes on her clipboard. "There," she declared. "All done. You won't even notice they're there." Mark clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. Arguing now wouldn't change anything. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "Yeah, because I'll be too busy noticing federal drones landing on my house." Little did he know, that sarcastic remark would prove eerily accurate sooner than he could imagine. It didn't take long for Mark to realize something was off. The very next evening, as he sat in his living room flipping through channels, he noticed a faint glow outside his window. At first, he thought it was just the reflection of the streetlights or maybe headlights from a passing car. But when he pulled back the curtain, what he saw made his heart skip a beat. Hovering near the edge of his roof was a cluster of strange lights. They weren't blinking like normal aircraft. Instead, they moved with an eerie smoothness, almost floating in place. Mark squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then one of the lights descended closer, revealing itself to be some kind of small machine, sleek, metallic, and unlike any drone he'd ever seen before. Its surface gleamed under the moonlight, and there was an insignia etched into its side that looked oddly official. "What on earth?" Mark muttered, stepping out onto his porch for a better view. As he watched, the drone zipped around his property in tight, deliberate patterns, scanning the area with a soft whirring sound. It wasn't random. It seemed to know exactly where it was going. And then, without warning, it rose back up and docked itself neatly onto one of the camera arrays Karen had installed earlier that day. Mark's jaw dropped. "Okay, this isn't normal," he whispered to himself. He grabbed his phone and snapped a few pictures, though he wasn't sure who he'd show them to. Who would believe him? Cameras turning into drone docking stations. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie. Over the next few nights, the phenomenon repeated itself. More drones appeared, each one behaving with uncanny precision. Sometimes they stayed for minutes, other times hours, but they always returned to the same spot, his roof. Mark started losing sleep, lying awake in bed listening to the faint hums vibrating through the walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that his house had become some sort of magnet for these machines. One night, curiosity got the better of him. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, Mark climbed onto his roof to get a closer look at the cameras, or whatever they really were. Up close, they looked even stranger. The lenses glowed faintly, and tiny circuits pulsed beneath their casings like they were alive. There were no brand names or labels, nothing that indicated they came from a store. These weren't ordinary security cameras. They were something else entirely. As Mark leaned in to inspect one of the devices, he heard a sharp beep behind him. Whipping around, he froze as another drone hovered mere feet away, its lens trained directly on him. For a moment, neither moved. Then, with a mechanical whir, the drone darted forward, circled him once, and shot straight up into the sky, disappearing into the darkness. Mark scrambled off the roof, his mind racing. What had he just witnessed? Why were these drones targeting his house? And most importantly, why hadn't anyone told him about this? Surely Karen wouldn't have knowingly turned his home into some kind of high-tech experiment. But then again, she wasn't exactly known for thinking things through. The next morning, Mark stared at the photos he'd taken, zooming in on the insignia stamped onto the side of the drones. It was sleek and modern, featuring an eagle encircled by stars. Something about it looked government. But why would federal drones care about his sleepy suburban neighborhood? That question gnawed at him all day, growing louder with every passing hour. By the time evening rolled around, Mark knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than Karen's overzealous HOA rules, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. The next morning, Mark's already frazzled nerves were pushed to their limit when he heard a knock at his door. He opened it expecting another HOA representative, or worse, Karen, but instead found two sharply dressed strangers standing on his porch. One was a tall man with close-cropped hair and an unreadable expression. The other was a woman in a crisp blazer, her posture radiating authority. Both carried badges clipped to their belts. "Mr. Thompson," the man asked, his voice calm but firm. "We're Agents Lewis and Paddle from the Department of Advanced Technology Oversight. May we come in?" Mark blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. "Department of what now?" "The Department of Advanced Technology Oversight," the woman repeated, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a federal agency." Mark hesitated, glancing between them. This had to be some kind of prank. Federal agents showing up at his door. Because of *drones*. But something about their demeanor told him they weren't joking. Reluctantly, he stepped aside and let them in. Once inside, Agent Lewis wasted no time getting to the point. "Mr. Thompson, we understand you've recently had certain equipment installed on your roof." "You mean those cameras Karen put up?" Mark asked, still skeptical. "Yeah, I've got questions about that too." Agent Patel nodded knowingly. Unfortunately, Ms. Wilkins wasn't aware of the full scope of what she was dealing with. Those aren't ordinary security cameras. They're part of a classified federal project. Mark stared at them, dumbfounded. "Wait, what? Classified? Are you telling me Karen turned my house into some sort of government outpost without even realizing it?" "Inadvertently, yes," Agent Lewis confirmed. The devices she installed are advanced receptors designed to interface with our drone docking network. They were placed here years ago during construction, but remained inactive until recently. Recently meaning? Mark prompted, his stomach sinking as pieces began falling into place. Meaning when Ms. Wilkins activated them by mistake, Agent Patel finished. She unknowingly triggered a dormant system embedded in your property. Mark sank onto his couch, running a hand through his hair. So let me get this straight. My house is now a docking station for secret government drones because Karen decided my neighborhood needed better security. Essentially, yes, Agent Lewis said, his tone neutral but tinged with frustration. And unfortunately, this has created complications we need to address immediately. Complications, Mark echoed, feeling like he was trapped in a bad dream. What kind of complications? Agent Patel exchanged a glance with her partner before continuing. These drones are part of a national surveillance initiative. Their purpose is to monitor critical infrastructure and assist in emergency response scenarios. However, they operate under strict protocols to ensure secrecy and operational integrity. Unauthorized activation compromises that. Mark groaned, rubbing his temples. Great. So not only does Karen ruin my weekends, but she also jeopardizes national security. It's not entirely her fault, Agent Lewis interjected quickly. The original installation was done discreetly decades ago, long before you or Ms. Wilkins moved into the area. Your home happens to sit within a strategically important zone, one we can't discuss further. Of course you can't, Mark muttered under his breath. He leaned forward, trying to process everything. So what happens now? Am I supposed to just live with these things buzzing around my roof forever? That won't be necessary, Agent Patel assured him. We'll take steps to relocate the docking station to a more secure location. In the meantime, we'll need your cooperation and discretion. Discretion? Mark repeated, raising an eyebrow. You think anyone would believe me if I tried to tell them? Agent Lewis gave him a tight smile. Let's not test that theory. As the agents stood to leave, handing Mark a business card with a phone number scrawled on the back, he couldn't help but feel like his life had been flipped upside down. Sure, the feds promised to fix things, but deep down, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. His quiet suburban existence had collided head-on with something far bigger and stranger than he could have imagined. Armed with the screenshots of the mysterious insignia and a head full of questions, Mark marched across the street to Karen's house. He was done playing nice. If anyone deserved to feel the weight of what had happened, it was her. After all, she'd been the one to barge into his life, literally, and turn his roof into some kind of federal drone hub. Karen answered the door mid-bite of a sandwich, crumbs dotting the corner of her mouth. Oh, Mark, she said around a mouthful, clearly unimpressed by his sudden appearance. What is it now? What is it now? Mark echoed incredulously, holding up his phone to show her the photos. How about the fact that those cameras you install are actually part of a secret government drone program? Did you know that? Karen blinked at him, then at the screen. For once, she didn't have an immediate retort. Instead, she swallowed hard and wiped her hands on a napkin. That's ridiculous. You're overreacting. Overreacting. Mark snapped, his voice rising. I'm not making this up, Karen. Federal agents showed up at my house because of what you did. These aren't security cameras. They're docking stations for classified drones. Before Karen could respond, there was another knock at the door. All three of them turned to see Agent Lewis standing there, looking every bit as serious as he had the day before. His sharp suit and polished shoes made Karen's floral print dress look even more out of place. Ms. Wilkins, Agent Lewis asked, his tone polite but firm. May I come in? Karen hesitated, clearly thrown off balance. She glanced at Mark, who crossed his arms smugly, then stepped aside to let the agent enter. Once inside, Agent Lewis wasted no time cutting to the chase. Ms. Wilkins, I understand you were responsible for installing equipment on Mr. Thompson's roof, he began, pulling out a small tablet. On it was a diagram of Mark's house, complete with highlighted areas showing where the devices were located. Can you explain why you chose to do this without consulting the proper authorities? Karen bristled, her usual bravado returning. Proper authorities. I'm the head of the HOA. This is my neighborhood. We have rules for a reason. Security cameras are standard practice. These aren't standard cameras, Agent Lewis corrected gently. They're advanced receptors embedded in the infrastructure of Mr. Thompson's home. Installing them improperly has compromised a highly sensitive federal operation. Karen's face went pale, her lips parting in disbelief. Compromised? What does that even mean? How was I supposed to know? That's precisely the issue, Agent Lewis replied, his tone softening slightly. You weren't aware of the protocols or the potential consequences. That's why projects like this are managed discreetly, with oversight from agencies like ours. For once, Karen was speechless. Her clipboard remained tucked under her arm, forgotten. The realization that she might have caused real trouble, not just for Mark, but potentially for national security, seemed to hit her like a ton of bricks. But Karen being Karen, she didn't stay silent for long. Well, if someone had told me about these so-called protocols, none of this would have happened. She shot back, pointing accusingly at Agent Lewis. And don't think I won't hold your agency accountable for this mess. This is unacceptable. Agent Lewis raised an eyebrow, unfazed by her outburst. We appreciate your concern, Ms. Wilkins, but rest assured, we'll handle the situation appropriately. In the meantime, we ask that you refrain from taking further action regarding Mr. Thompson's property or any other homes in the neighborhood. Mark couldn't help but smirk as Karen deflated visibly. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely rattled. But knowing Karen, it wouldn't last long. She already seemed to be plotting her next move, muttering something about legal action and transparency. As Agent Lewis excused himself and headed back to his car, Mark lingered behind, shooting Karen a triumphant grin. Looks like you finally met your match, huh? Karen narrowed her eyes at him, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. Don't think this is over, Mark. Not by a long shot. But deep down, they both knew the truth. Karen had bitten off more than she could chew, and now the entire neighborhood was caught in the fallout. The next morning, Mark's house became ground zero for what could only be described as a high-tech invasion. A team of technicians from DATO, clad in uniforms that looked more NASA than neighborhood, descended on his property with an arsenal of equipment. They parked their unmarked vans along the curb, unloaded laptops and scanners, and began dismantling sections of his roof with alarming efficiency. Mark watched from the sidelines, sipping coffee and trying to wrap his head around the scene unfolding before him. These weren't your average handymen. They moved with military precision, speaking in clipped tones and consulting blueprints that seemed to glow faintly under the sun. It was as if they'd stepped straight out of a sci-fi movie. And somehow Mark's quiet suburban home had become the set. As the workers peeled back layers of shingles, one of them called out, "Sir, you'll want to see this." Mark hesitated, unsure whether he actually did want to see whatever it was. But curiosity got the better of him, and he climbed up a ladder to join them on the roof. What he saw left him speechless. Beneath the surface of his ordinary-looking roof lay a labyrinth of wires, circuits, and metallic conduits unlike anything he'd ever imagined. The infrastructure wasn't just advanced, it was otherworldly. Tiny lights pulsed rhythmically along the pathways, and symbols etched into the panels suggested technology far beyond current public knowledge. This wasn't something installed recently by accident. Whoever had built this had planned it decades ago, embedding it deep within the structure of his home without anyone noticing. Agent Patel appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. "This confirms our suspicions," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "Your house is part of a larger network, a strategic initiative tied to national defense." Strategic how? Mark asked, still staring at the alien-like machinery beneath his feet. I thought this was about drones. It's bigger than that, Agent Pottle explained. Your neighborhood sits near critical communication hubs. When these systems were designed years ago, locations like yours were chosen for their proximity to key infrastructure. Think of it as a failsafe, a way to monitor and respond to threats quickly. Mark frowned. So my house has been sitting on some secret government blueprint all this time. Why didn't anyone tell me when I bought it? The program predates most modern disclosure laws, Agent Lewis chimed in, joining them on the roof. And frankly, Mr. Thompson, few people would have believed you if they had. Mark let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, no kidding. If I tried to explain this to someone, they'd think I was nuts. The agents exchanged a glance but didn't argue. Instead, they focused on explaining the next steps. The drone docking station would need to be relocated to a more secure facility, which meant removing parts of Mark's roof entirely. While DATO promised to repair everything and compensate him generously, the process would take weeks, maybe months. By mid-afternoon, word of the commotion had spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, craning their necks to catch glimpses of the activity. Some whispered theories about aliens or spy satellites. Others speculated about hidden treasure buried under Mark's foundation. Karen, predictably, seized the opportunity to hold an impromptu HOA meeting right there on Mark's front lawn. This is unacceptable, she declared, standing atop a folding chair like a politician addressing her constituents. We deserve answers. Transparency. How do we know this isn't a threat to our safety? Mark rolled his eyes, leaning against the porch railing as he watched her perform. Trust Karen to turn a federal investigation into her own personal soapbox. Still, he couldn't deny that her theatrics drew attention. Attention that made it clear this wasn't just his problem anymore. His sleepy cul-de-sac had become the center of something much bigger, and everyone was starting to feel the ripple effects. As the day wore on, Mark found himself torn between frustration and fascination. On one hand, his life had been turned upside down, all because Karen couldn't resist meddling. On the other hand, he couldn't help but marvel at the sheer scale of what lay hidden beneath his roof. Whatever secrets his house held, they were far from ordinary. And Mark had a sinking feeling he was only scratching the surface. Word of the bizarre events at Mark's house spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. By Monday morning, it felt like everyone had an opinion, and most of them weren't favorable toward Mark. Thanks to Karen's dramatic flair and her knack for spinning stories, rumors began swirling that Mark had somehow orchestrated the entire situation. Some accused him of being in cahoots with the government, while others whispered about secret experiments or even alien technology. It didn't help that DATO's technicians were still swarming his property, their vans parked conspicuously along the curb. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now eyed him with suspicion, whispering behind cupped hands as he walked by. Even Mrs. Peterson, usually so kind, gave him a wary smile and hurried away when she saw him coming. The tension reached a boiling point on Wednesday evening when a small group of protesters showed up outside Mark's house. Armed with handmade signs reading "No spies in our backyard" and "Protect our privacy," they marched back and forth on the sidewalk, chanting slogans loud enough to rattle windows. At first, Mark tried to ignore them, retreating indoors with a cup of coffee and the TV volume turned up high. But as the days passed and the protests grew larger, staying out of sight became impossible. Karen, predictably, was at the center of it all. She organized community meetings under the guise of demanding transparency, positioning herself as the voice of reason despite being the one who'd started the chaos in the first place. During one particularly heated gathering in the local park, she stood before a crowd of disgruntled neighbors and declared, "We can't let this go unchecked. If Mark's house is part of some secret operation, then we deserve answers." Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. Here was Karen, the very person responsible for activating the drone system, acting like she was defending the neighborhood against some shadowy conspiracy. He wanted to stand up and call her out, but every time he tried, someone else would cut him off, accusing him of deflecting blame or hiding information. Feeling increasingly isolated, Mark decided to confront Karen directly after one of her rallies. As the crowd dispersed, he approached her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "You've got some nerve," he said, his voice low but firm. "This whole mess started because of you, and now you're pretending to be the hero." Karen whirled around, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "Oh, please, Mark. Don't act like you're innocent here. You knew something was going on. You must have suspected something." "Suspected?" Mark repeated incredulously. "Are you serious? I'm just as clueless as everyone else. The only difference is my roof got torn apart because of your reckless decisions." "Well, maybe if you'd spoken up sooner," Karen began, but Mark cut her off. "Spoken up about what?" "That federal agents showed up at my door saying my house is part of some classified project. Who exactly was I supposed to tell?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For once, she seemed genuinely unsure of herself. Instead, she muttered something vague about needing to review HOA policies and stormed off, leaving Mark standing alone in the emptying park. As the days dragged on, Mark found himself withdrawing further from the neighborhood. Conversations with neighbors turned awkward, filled with thinly veiled accusations or uncomfortable silences. Even simple trips to the grocery store felt like walking through a gauntlet of judgmental stares. It was exhausting and infuriating. How had he gone from being a quiet, unassuming resident to public enemy number one? But amidst the frustration, there was also a growing sense of clarity. Mark realized that the hostility wasn't really about him. It was about fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of losing control. Fear of discovering that their safe little suburb wasn't as ordinary as they'd always believed. And unfortunately for Mark, he'd become the lightning rod for all those anxieties. Late one night, as he sat alone in his living room staring at the flickering TV screen, Mark sighed deeply. The protests outside had finally died down, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than the noise. He glanced at the stack of documents the HOA had given him. Legal agreements, confidentiality clauses, compensation offers, and wondered if signing them would truly make things better, or would it just bury the truth deeper, leaving him and everyone else trapped in a web of secrets they might never fully understand. After weeks of chaos, negotiations, and endless back and forth with DATO, a resolution finally seemed within reach. The agency agreed to dismantle the drone docking station entirely, relocating it to a secure facility miles away from the neighborhood. In exchange, they offered compensation packages to affected homeowners, Mark included. For most residents, this was enough to quiet their concerns. Checks were signed, confidentiality agreements were inked, and life in the cul-de-sac slowly began returning to normal. Karen, ever the opportunist, seized the chance to declare victory for the HOA. At a final community meeting, she stood before her neighbors, chest puffed out like a proud peacock. "Thanks to my diligence and leadership," she announced, "we've ensured transparency and accountability for everyone involved." No one mentioned that her actions had caused the entire mess in the first place, or that federal agents had essentially shut her down at every turn. To Karen, rewriting history was just another day's work. For Mark, however, closure wasn't so simple. Though his roof had been repaired and his bank account padded with a hefty settlement, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation remained unresolved. Nights still felt quieter than they used to, but not in a comforting way. It was as if the air itself carried an unspoken tension, lingering long after the drones had vanished. One evening, as he sat on his porch nursing a cup of coffee, Mark noticed a faint light hovering near the horizon. At first, he thought it was a plane or maybe a distant star, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it drifted closer until it hovered directly above his street. His heart sank as realization dawned. It was another drone. Only this time, it didn't dock. It simply lingered, watching. Mark froze, unsure whether to call DATO or retreat inside. Before he could decide, the drone emitted a soft hum and darted upward, disappearing into the night sky as quickly as it had appeared. He exhaled sharply, his hands trembling slightly around the coffee mug. This wasn't supposed to happen. They'd promised the system would be deactivated, so why did it feel like someone, or something, was still keeping tabs on him? Over the following days, Mark tried to convince himself it was paranoia. Maybe it was just a rogue device left behind by accident. Or perhaps it belonged to some unrelated project. He'd seen plenty of delivery drones buzzing around town lately. But deep down, he knew better. That insignia etched onto the side of the machine matched the one DATO had shown him weeks earlier. Whatever these drones were doing, they weren't done yet. Despite his unease, Mark kept quiet. What could he say? Telling his neighbors would only reignite the panic, and likely get him labeled as unstable. Even calling DATO felt futile. Their agents had already made it clear that further questions wouldn't be welcomed. Instead, he resolved to stay vigilant, keeping his phone handy and snapping photos whenever he spotted anything unusual. As the weeks turned into months, life in the neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm. Protest signs were taken down, gossip faded, and Karen resumed enforcing petty HOA rules with renewed vigor. To outsiders, everything looked perfectly ordinary. But Mark knew better. Every shadow in the sky, every hum in the distance, reminded him that his quiet suburban existence had been forever altered. Late one night, unable to sleep, Mark stepped outside and stared up at the stars. Somewhere out there, unseen eyes might still be watching, not just his house, but countless others like it. He didn't know who was pulling the strings or why his home had been chosen for such a strange role in national security. All he knew was that sometimes ignorance really was bliss, and once you pulled back the curtain, there was no going back. With a sigh, Mark turned and went back inside, locking the door behind him. Life moved forward, as it always did. But as he lay in bed listening to the faint hum of electricity coursing through his walls, he couldn't help but wonder what secrets were still hidden beneath the surface. And more importantly, how long would it take before they came knocking again?